Hello everybody, welcome to Drydock episode 117. This week's questions are taken from Guide 182, the Guide to the Indefatigable class, and then a whole medley of the last of the revoiced videos. So that's Bismarck, Gangut, Tegethoff, and Corbet. So let's begin with these questions. UNSC Forward On to Dawn asks, on the subject of battle cruisers, do you think the Royal Navy would have been better off in the long run by building dreadnoughtised armoured cruisers, i.e. ships with a uniform main battery of 9.2-inch guns and turbine propulsion, as opposed to the actual battle cruisers? Well, it's certainly what the Germans thought the British were building, hence the construction of SMS Blücher, rather than something vaguely approaching von der Tann as their first effort. I think the rise of the battle cruiser, as we understand it, armed with battleship caliber weapons, probably would have happened sooner rather than later anyway. So I guess in that respect, you could possibly argue that it was better to go on the path that they did, as that it was a more clear and consistent path. And if you imagine, let's say a combat in World War One, where you've got a mix of these dreadnoughtised armoured cruisers together with probably true battle cruisers, which would have, I think, arisen around about 1910, 1911, maybe a year or two either side of that. So you'd probably be looking at something like the Lions, because that would have been the standard of dreadnought gunnery at the time. Now, obviously, von der Tann and possibly the next German battle cruiser down the line would also have been sort of Blücher or improved Blücher types, if everyone thought that's how things were going. But having a battle line of fast armoured cruisers with a uniform armament combined with these much heavier gunned ships, that's probably actually going to end up worse. Because if you look at something like Invincible versus Lutzow, Invincible was at least able to deal fatal damage to Lutzow, even if it took fatal damage in return, whereas a theoretical Invincible that has a battery of maybe 10 9.2-inch guns probably laid out something akin to Dreadnought, considering that would have been its contemporary at the time. So broadside of 8, or maybe some of the later iterations might have had a broadside of 10 guns. Against a ship that's armed with 12-inch guns, or the flip side, obviously, a German ship with 8.2-inch guns versus a ship armed with 13.5-inch guns, they'd actually die off much, much faster. I mean, you saw what happened to some of the later armoured cruisers, like Defence, which didn't have anything much different in the way of armour. Okay, they had slightly fewer guns, but in terms of the 9.2-inch ones, but it didn't really help them all that much. So you could see more casualties as a result. And the reason I think that jump would have happened eventually is because everyone was trying to one-up each other in that naval arms race. So even if both sides had been building a kind of a Blücher-style ship, whether with 8.2-inch guns or 9.2-inch guns or whatever, at some point someone's going to go looking for an escalation to get the advantage over the other side. And to say that at that point, when they start looking for that escalation, they'll be looking at, okay, well, we've got this very large armoured cruiser. It's got a uniform main battery. Now what happens if we scale that up further and make battleship guns on it? Because that kind of escalation from 8.1, 8.2-inch to and 9.2-inch to 11 or 12-inch and further up, that wouldn't then occur, because why in 1910, 1911, when your main battleship caliber is 13.5-inch for the British, 12-inch for the German, why would you go to a caliber that you've just discarded for your theoretical now battlecruiser armament? Although as they would be fractionally smaller and therefore somewhat cheaper, you might see more of them. and then maybe the sort of the true battle cruisers that would be coming in just before the First World War might end up as being squadron leaders or flotilla leaders, almost like an extremely large and expensive version of destroyers and flotilla leaders down at the other end of things. However, the more interesting implication is when you get to the other end of World War I and then into the 1920s, when you've got the naval treaties being renegotiated, the Washington Treaty and such, because now the battle cruisers are obviously going to get classed as capital ships, but now you've got these very large, very heavily armed ships that are still definitely not capital ships, but probably ones you want to regulate. So you might then see the Washington Naval Treaty built around perhaps a slightly higher tonnage displacement, because at least for their cruiser category, because you're going to have all these cruisers with a very useful main battery, reasonable armour. The nation certainly will not have wanted to drop that investment entirely, and so you might then see the cruiser tonnage actually built up significantly more. So you might end up with displacement capped at maybe something like 15 or 18,000 tons, and gun caliber capped at something like 9.2, or even maybe the US might even press for 10 inches given the Tennessees. So yeah, probably like something like along the lines of a 15,000 ton ship armed with 8 to 10 9.2 inch or 6 to 8 10-inch guns might be the new standard for cruisers, given that obviously at this point battleships are up to 16-inch. Reiver asks, why was New Zealand paying for the loan for HMS New Zealand up through 1944? You'd think the British could give them a break during World War II. You'd think, but the international financing system, as well as things like bonds and loans, especially intergovernmental ones, are one weird conundrum which I have no real full understanding of, and I suspect requires a sort of cross-classing in both history and finance in order to fully comprehend. But what I do know when it comes to sort of sea-related issues and financing is that, especially when you're dealing with Britain, there are all sorts of weird and wonderful financial issues. I mean, there are bonds that are still out there, financial bonds that people have bought, that are issuing interest, obviously to the holders, which were issued originally to help the government pay off the debt from the South Sea bubble at the beginning of the 1700s. Okay, they've been through a number of recapitalisations since then, which has meant that there's a bunch of bonds out there now where the original debt might have been, say, the South Sea bubble, but then 80, 100 years on, the government recapitalised those to help pay for the Napoleonic Wars, and then 20 years down the line recapitalised both of them to help pay for the freeing of slaves in the Empire, and then 2-3 decades down the line from there recapitalised a whole range of all of those three kinds of bonds to help pay for the Crimean War, and so on and so on. And this is why you occasionally see stupid newspaper headlines like, "Oh, we're still paying off the descendants. That we're still paying off the money that was paid to end slavery." It's like, no, you're paying off bonds that were raised, and the government has never paid back. Which that's just a legal financial instrument. But anyway, that aside, when it comes to HMS New Zealand, it's similar, basically the same kind of thing. International finance really doesn't care about there being a war on. I mean, heck, the UK government only paid back some of its World War I debts within the last 5 or 6 years. I don't know quite what's happened with the World War II ones off the top of my head, but that would basically be the reason that New Zealand was still paying the loan in the middle of World War II, because, well, it's a loan. You still have to pay it regardless, and that would be applying on all sides. I think at some point there was even during the Lend-Lease deal because Britain defaulted on some of its World War One loans from America back in the period of the Great Depression. There was some discussion about during Lend-Lease as to whether or not the UK would have to pay some of those loans back again during World War Two so that it could get other loans to help it pay for World War Two. This is why I don't do finance. Snebby Webby asks, what would have happened if the British Grand Fleet and Battlecruiser Fleet had had reversed gunnery practices at Jutland? Overall, that's actually a net win for the British, weirdly enough. You might not think it to be so, because you'd be talking about, well, flipping the small element, the Battlecruiser Fleet's awful gunnery, onto the Grand Fleet. But when you look at the way that the battle went down, what was the Grand Fleet actually doing when it came to gunnery? There were the two big cross-the-T moments, and that was about it. A little bit about with the death ride of the battle cruisers towards the end of the second one, but that was really the extent of the Grand Fleet's gunnery. And because of some of the issues with the shells that they had, which were covered in earlier this month on the video regarding naval shells, the individual hits didn't do awful amounts of damage, but they added up. But the main effect of those moments was less about inflicting huge amounts of damage on the German ships, although various German battleships did get damaged. Sheer turned away because running into a cross-the-T moment when the fleet that's crossing your T outnumbers you and there's a storm of splinters and water spouts around you, regardless of exactly how many hits are landing on your ships, is a situation you just need to get out of. So if that fire was slightly less accurate individually, the sheer volume of fire probably would have made up for it, and the situation in terms of sheer turning away wouldn't have been all that much different. Although sadly we would have lost HMS Iron Duke, aka World War One aimbot, which wouldn't have lost the ship, but the achievements of Iron Duke's gunners would have probably gone by the wayside, which is a bit of a shame. But on the other hand, if you put the accurate gunnery standards for the Grand Fleet, which obviously were also exhibited by 5th Battle Squadron, and you put those over onto the Battlecruiser Fleet, then that means during the initial Battlecruiser engagement, the British ships are actually shooting straight. And we know from, obviously, when they did engage, that although the British Battlecruisers came off the worse, the few times they did land their big shell hits, it did mess up the German ships to a certain degree. So if the British battlecruisers now have concentrated, fairly accurate fire, then Hipper's going to come off a lot worse from that engagement. Now, obviously, that means when you've got the 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron versus Lutzow and Der Flinger, etc., that's probably just going to end with Invincible getting blasted, because it's not going to have the kind of accurate Grand Fleet gunnery that it did. And 5th Battle Squadron's intervention is going to be somewhat lessened as well, because obviously they also had Grand Fleet standard gunnery. But their intervention may not be quite as needed, because BT ships might actually have reduced the German battle cruisers' combat capabilities quite considerably fairly quickly. Effectively, just imagine transposing 5th Battle Squadron's gunnery onto the battlecruiser fleet. So yeah, net win for the British, weirdly enough, given the circumstances. Thomas Back in the Mo asks, what if there were no limits on warship sizes due to treaty? How crazy do you think warships would eventually evolve to be? So even without the treaties, I don't think that ships would have gotten much larger than, say, something like HMS Incomparable. I think the Tillmans are probably actually, although they're technically feasible, I think they're probably actually a little bit of a bridge too far. At least, well, some of the Tillman designs are a bit more feasible than others. Tillman 4.2 is just, no. And the reason for this is related to a lot of the problems actually that the French had. That they were the ones who had this the most, although the Germans experienced it also to a reasonable degree. The British also experienced this, actually. And whilst it was experienced somewhat less by the Americans and Japanese, even they had the issue, and that is size of infrastructure. And that's not even just, can you make the guns, can you make the armour? 18, 20-inch guns and 16, 18-inch thick armour is quite the technical achievement. It's, do you have the slipways that are big enough to build these ships? Do you have the infrastructure around those slipways to build those ships? Because if you've got a slipway that's big enough but was previously used just to build cruise liners, you may not have the kind of heavy lift gear that you need to drop in a triple 18-inch turret or something like that. So you might have to build all of that. And then even assuming you can manufacture the parts and you've got the slipway big enough to build the thing, or close enough, maybe you do a French-style approach where you build most of the ship and attach the bow or stern later on, you then have the issue of, how do you maintain the ship? Where does it berth? Do you have the dock pier and dockside facilities for it to anchor at? Is the harbour depth deep enough for the draft of your massive ship? Where are the refuelling facilities in relation to that? Because if your refuelling facilities are in harbours that maybe have a 28-foot depth or a 30-foot depth, and your ship has a 32-foot draft, well, you're not going to refuel your ship, are you? Is the channel wide enough for your ship to come through? The British had this kind of problem when they were looking at ships of hood size and above. They had some facilities that could, but to enable other facilities, they would have to either expand the facilities or dredge the channels or widen the channels. Same problem in some ways that the Americans had with the Panama Canal. And you even see that today with HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales. In order for them to get to Portsmouth, Portsmouth's harbour channel had to be dredged to let them in. So there's all these kinds of complications, and the bigger the ship gets, the more these complications arise. You might build something hood size, something Iowa size, something even Yamato size, and maybe most of your large-scale battleship infrastructure can still support it, depending on the nation. As I say, the French constantly had to be expanding their dockyards to afford something the size of first Dunkirk and Strasbourg and then Richelieu. But once you get up to something incomparable size, 1,000 feet long, or something like the Japanese number 13, or one of the larger Tillman designs, you're going to have to do a serious amount of infrastructure upgrade, because it's not, bearing in mind with obviously limited fuel stocks and the fact you've got multiple theatres of operation, it's not just like you say, we have one dockyard that can do this. Because especially if you're America, that may well not be enough. Maybe if you're France or Germany, that might be enough. But if you're America with two coasts, or you're Britain with an overseas empire, you need more than one dockyard in different locations that can handle that ship. And all of that associated expense means that I think, as I said somewhat before, 18, maybe 20-inch guns are probably going to be the limit for anything that's not a complete waste of time and money. And size-wise, you're probably not going to see much in the World War I interwar era that's going to exceed, by say the 30s, you're not going to see much that's going to be exceeding probably 80 to 100,000 tons, and that would be an absolute kind of upper limit. It would then be a case of in the 1930s of, if we physically can build ships bigger, we're going to have to massively invest in naval infrastructure. Aravale asks, given how limited the Revenge class were by the Second World War, was there any consideration given to building modern hulls and stealing the guns and or turrets from the Revenges to make useful battleships, so effectively building 4 more Vanguard hulls and slapping the guns and turrets from the Revenges on them? And if not, your thoughts on the viability of the idea and possible uses for the R-class hulls once the guns and turrets were removed. During the Second World War, no, simply because to build the requisite number of hulls would have occupied dockyard space that was sorely needed both to complete fleet carriers and also to refit, repair and support the existing capital ships. Not to mention the fact that it would have taken 2 to 3 years to go from keel laying to having the ships in the water, assuming that everything went fine, which obviously doesn't involve bombing, raids, reprioritization of equipment and that kind of thing. And initially people thought the war wasn't going to last that long, which is a perennial problem of world wars. And by the time it became clear that the war was going to last that long, Well, at that point, you're kind of in late 41, early 42, at which point, the R-class is kind of getting a bit long in the tooth, but they're still useful as convoy escorts. But two, the war at that point, obviously we know, is only going to last about 3 more years. They don't strictly know that, but the idea of then starting mid-war to build additional battleships to take part in a conflict that will probably at least be winding down by the time they're complete doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense. And at that point in the middle of the war, you need those shipyards for repairing of other ships, as I said, but also by the time you even start to maybe think about doing that, you are looking at a period where you know what you're up against, and you also know that you've probably got enough capital ships, given that by that point Germany would be down to 2 operational capital ships. Italy is not doing terribly well, and then all you've got to worry about is Japan, and from a fleet perspective, and Japan has the US Navy to worry about. In terms of the overall viability of the idea, the R-class were supposed to be replaced by the King George V class as they came online if war hadn't broken out, and then the Lions would have replaced the Queen Elizabeths, and then some future design beyond the Lions would have replaced the renowned Repulse, Hood, Nelson and Rodney. Now, because obviously it would be a follow-on design, and at that point in 43-ish, well, probably 42 when they would have started finalising the design for whatever succeeds the line, they probably would have known a bit more about the Yamatos, and the Americans would have been laying down the Iowas, so they would have had to go and escalate beyond even the Lions. So yeah, I don't think even in a peacetime environment they would have done so if things progressed as normal. The only 2 scenarios I can see where it could be done, it would be done, because the thing is, yes, it could be done. Vanguard is kind of the proof of concept that it can be done. But yeah, the 2 conceptual scenarios in which it might happen would be, one, if there's some serious unsolvable problem with the 16-inch gun for the Lions. They were already delayed somewhat by developmental issues with the 16-inch gun, and eventually it was that slight delay that ended up with Lion and Temeraire being cancelled. If we're in a peacetime scenario building up to a war at some point between 42 and 44, but someone turns around in, say, 1940 and says, look, we just can't get these 16-inch guns to work for whatever reason, then at that point, with the King George V's beginning to come into service and the Revengers starting to be decommissioned, then you might see them say, oh, okay, we've got these 15-inch guns that are coming out of service on the Revengers. We've got the spare turrets for which we're turning into a Vanguard, so rather than halt construction on the battleships entirely, how about we drop the 15-inch 42s into a slightly adapted version of the 16-inch triple turret was being worked out for the Lions, and then you get effectively a better armoured version of what was being looked at for the King George V's originally, which would be 3 triple 15-inch, and they'd have all the modifications that Vanguard did, greater elevation, ability to fire supercharges, and all that kind of stuff. The other scenario would be maybe as the Lions are beginning to come into service, so we're talking 42-ish, assuming that the issues with their 16-inch guns have been worked out, but maybe it's looking like, through a variety of escalations, that war is absolutely certain to hit, or near enough as can be certain, in maybe 1944, then Vanguard in theory would be well along the way, obviously without wartime restrictions, and then they might look at repeating Vanguard several times to get a bunch of extra capital ships out there either before or just as soon as the war kicks off, because if they're looking at, say, yeah, let's say 41, 42, and they think, okay, there's going to be a war at the end of 43, 44, we can see it coming, we've got a year and a half, 2.5 years, we're not quite finished with our Lion successor design, and even if we were, it would take slightly longer than that to get them all into service, assuming we don't have any problems with the guns like we have with the Lions. So we'll keep working on that, we'll keep trying to work that out, but as an insurance measure in the interim, we've got a Vanguard hull, we know it works, we've got a bunch of 15-inch guns, we think we can upgrade them to be vaguely competitive, so let's just copy-paste a bunch of Vanguards. That I can kind of see as another thing that might happen. But both those scenarios are a little bit niche. As to what you do with the R-class hulls once the guns and turrets are removed, to be honest, they'd probably just go for scrap. If they didn't go for scrap, then I wouldn't be surprised to see them used as depot ships, effectively ammunition barges, accommodation ships, training hulks, that kind of stuff. That I don't think they're going to be turned into massive anti-aircraft vessels because they're a bit too slow, really. Damn Daniel asks, why did the all-or-nothing armour scheme end up more or less outclassing and replacing the Turtleback? So I think I've addressed this question in some previous Drydocks, but I'll do a quick précis here for those of you who might be new to all of this. The short version is that the Turtleback, as implemented in Bismarck and Tirpitz, is also part of a somewhat distributed armour scheme. And a distributed armour scheme means you have more armour over the overall surface area of your ship, but because you're putting that weight over a wider surface area rather than just over the vitals, the armour that you can put over the vitals must necessarily be thinner for a similar amount of weight devoted to armour. Otherwise you start making sacrifices on either guns or speed if you want to have a similar main belt thickness, at which point the all or nothing ship will have either better speed, better firepower, or both. So it's about absolute protection against incoming shellfire in the first place. The Turtleback, yes, at short range might protect you from incoming shellfire to your vitals slightly better, but at times it may also not. That actually failed and worked against Bismarck at least twice during its final engagement. With the Turtleback, I'm actually turning the shell in and down towards the vitals, which is exactly the opposite of what it's supposed to do. And it also means that both bombs and shells, even if the Turtleback armour keeps the explosives out of the citadels, you still have the problem of you've got a bomb and or shell exploding inside your ship and relatively deep inside your ship. Whereas with the all or nothing system, apart from the weight savings, if it stops a shell and or bomb, it's either stopping it dead outside your ship or, in the case of the armoured deck, in the very upper parts of your ship where it's much less likely to do significant damage to the rather important things internally. And the other major drawback of the Turtleback scheme, apart from the fact it's much more vulnerable to long-range fire than the all-or-nothing scheme, is that you can get what's called the free surface effect, which is that the Turtleback is low enough, you can get flooding coming in above that deck armour, which means that if the Turtleback remains unbreached, the water's going to be sitting quite high up in your ship, and as soon as the ship rolls or lists for any reason, like say the fact someone's poking holes in the side of your ship, then you've suddenly got several thousand tons of uninvited weight in an area fairly high up in the ship, which is going to significantly compromise your stability, which could then cause your ship to just roll over and sink, even though your citadel's not been breached, and it also reduces the overall reserve buoyancy, which is the area of the citadel, the volume of the citadel, which you can see there is obviously a bit smaller, and that means that even if the free surface effect doesn't just roll you over or put you on your side, you could end up taking up so much water above your armour deck that even assuming the armour deck remains completely uncompromised, the ship ends up sinking anyway because it's lost positive buoyancy. Tommaso Balconi asks, What do you think makes a good naval historian or a good historian in general, and how would you define one? Do you think it comes down to digging through hundreds of different sources and then puzzling together a possible truth, or is there more to it than that? Well, now isn't that a loaded question? Okay, well, at least in my view, and some of this might sound a little bit trite, but hopefully some of it will have a little bit more insight as well. Firstly, a good naval historian doesn't try to run before he can walk. So just because you happen to have read a couple of books on one particular aspect of the naval war of World War II, that doesn't make you an instant expert in necessarily even that engagement, let alone the entirety of World War II or all naval technology and battles everywhere at all times. To be honest, I don't think anyone's ever going to reach that level because there's just so much history. But yeah, kind of pace yourself. A good naval historian will pace themselves to what they know. If they're an expert in a particular field, then they will talk with authority in that field. If they understand things from multiple fields, then they talk about multiple fields. But when they reach sort of their personal frontier where they don't know all that much about something or some particular field, they should be prepared to say, actually, you know what? I don't know that. And I'm going to go and try and find somebody who does know that to answer that particular question. Or I'm going to go back and do some research and then come back to you with an answer that I believe based on the research, rather than just trying to sort of hand wave it and go, oh, well, yes, I know all about World War II, but I'm now going to answer in extreme detail about the naval tactics of ancient Sumer or something like that. Secondly, a good naval historian does a wide range of research. So if, for example, you're looking at, say, the Battle of Narvik, which obviously I did recently, then obviously try and find primary sources where you can. And then when you do, look at the full range of them. So don't just look at, this is the war log of HMS Hotspur, for example, and say, right, well, that's what happened in the first battle. Or look at the log for Cossack and say, no, this is what happened in the second battle, at least first and second as far as the British are concerned. Look at all of them, at least all the ones that survived. So look at Punjabi, look at Warspite, look at Hostile, look at Foxhound. What do all of those logs say? And then try and find out what the German logs say. If you can't speak German, or if those archive materials are available in English but they're too far away for you, then try and find some good books that cover the subject from the German perspective, and then amalgamate everything together. And next would be, don't be afraid to be wrong, and don't be afraid to admit that you're wrong. And that can take two forms. One, you might just make a flat-out wrong statement, whether because you're speaking off the cuff or because you've just read something that's slightly in error. And so let's say, actually, there's a good example. Back in some of the early days, I kept having this weird sort of bugbear in my head where I kept thinking the Montanas could only do 23 to 24 knots. And what was happening was, in my head, I was getting confused between the two 12, 16-inch gun designs, the South Dakota 1920s design, which could probably just about make that, and the Montanas. And for some reason, their speed statistics got conflated in my head. So I kept saying, the Montanas were slow, which technically they were compared to the Iowas. But then my brain was jumping ahead and saying, they're slow, 12, 16-inch guns, 23 knots, right, that's their speed. When obviously they weren't. They would have been capable of about 28-ish knots, give or take. So yeah, I was wrong there. It wasn't that I didn't know the fact, if I'd actually stopped to triple check it, but it was so fixed in my mind that was a reliable figure, but just wires crossed and I got it wrong. Which I suppose means you should always check even things that seem basic facts to you. The other way that you can be wrong is if you have read about something, you've researched something, it appears to be all above board, and then later scholarship comes along and then can prove that, in fact, this wasn't the case. So you would have been, quote unquote, right at the time, but now you're not. So a good example of that would be, for however many years everybody, at least in the Western world, thought that Fushida's account of Midway was accurate, and so you'll see a lot of books published about Midway, in what effectively amounts to about the Cold War period, will talk about how one of the reasons the Japanese carriers went up like fireworks was because their decks were packed with aircraft, and the bombs just sort of set all of that off, and that's one of the big causes for the Inferno and such like. But then later on, we obviously discover that actually Fushida was, shall we say, not entirely accurate with that particular assessment, and in fact the decks were mostly clear apart from some combat air patrol zeros that were about to take off. And now books published that. Now, that doesn't mean that the rest of the analysis in those older books is necessarily faulty or wrong, but it does mean that that little particular aspect is wrong. But then someone who's written about that, published that, believed that, if they're a good naval historian, will go, oh, okay, this is what the new scholarship says. I guess this will have to be revised. And if there is a reprint of that book, then later on, you just say, okay, well, we have to correct that now. And the final thing in this very abbreviated, because I could go on about this for an entire hour's video, but the final thing I would say is never, ever stop listening. Because no matter how good you are never going to be the expert in everything. And I know this comes a little bit to my first point, but even once you know an awful lot, if you study naval history generally, so you're looking at lots of different things, different navies, different time periods, different wars, there is always going to be someone who has studied, or multiple someones who have studied particular subjects in a lot more detail than you have. So there'll be someone out there, for example, with the recent video on naval shells. As both a historian and an engineer, I obviously can make a video like that by doing my research. But there will be people who have either spent their entire lives as gunners or their entire lives in designing artillery or shells or some other similar system, or people who have just spent more time researching that particular subject in extensive detail. And so they're going to know more. And so if they come in and they offer expanded comments or more information, don't just say, oh, well, I think I know enough, thank you very much. Listen. Because apart from anything, knowledge is never a bad thing, but at least in naval history. But you might learn something new. You might be able to draw a new connection that you hadn't realised before. And similarly, if you want to flip it on its head, and if you're one of the type you want to be very, very expert on a particular niche field rather than looking at things overall, then again, listen to other people who know a bit more about the general history. So pick a random navy, that's Japanese Navy. Let's say you decide to become an expert in the Japanese Navy. Okay, great, fantastic. That means people who want to know about the Japanese Navy should be coming to listen to you. But equally speaking, if you want to know more about the Royal Navy or the American Navy or the Royal Australian Navy, then someone listen to the people who have specialised in that, or someone who's looked at both sides and has studied it in more of a general history, rather than just say, oh yes, well, I've read this report by this particular person within the Navy that I'm studying, and they think this about this other Navy, therefore that is the case. It's always beneficial to get another point of view. And with that, considering that I've gone on for almost 10 minutes, I'll round that out there and then. Kevin Kennelly asks, what is a relined gun? So as Kevin suggests in his question, it probably is part of the subject for one of the later episodes of the series on naval guns, but in very brief, a naval gun has an inner liner jacket, which is where all the rifling is, and that can come in two forms. One where that lining is much more easily detached from the outer body of the barrel, and the other in which, well, simply put, it isn't. And so those rifling grooves will get worn out by the stress and erosion of having guns fired and shells travelling down them at high speed, with obviously all the hot combustion gases following after. So once they've worn down to a certain point, it needs to be replaced. Depending on the design of the gun, you might either be able to detach the liner, extract the liner, and replace it with a new one, and the overall gun therefore goes back in with a new liner. Or alternatively, in some forms of gun construction, you might just find it quicker, cheaper, and easier to just manufacture multiple of those guns, keep a bunch of them in reserve, and when one of them wears out, you just take it out and put in a new one. And then maybe if your ship's having an unusually long career and you have that kind of gun, then maybe you might want to bore out the internal part of the gun and insert a new liner, as opposed to just detaching and removing. But that's a very expensive and long-term process, and if you're just replacing the gun, it's easier for general service. John Fisher asks, why didn't France just scrap the Danton class and put the money in materials into building a new Dreadnought type, since they were all built and completed well after Dreadnought herself? So there are a number of reasons. The Dantons are actually pretty big ships. They're actually a couple of 1,000 tons heavier than the South Carolinas, so they're fairly substantial. They are also fairly heavily armed for pre-Dreadnought. They're almost a semi-Dreadnought in some ways, and the French believed that gunnery was going to take place at a somewhat shorter range than what everybody else tended to believe for a given time period during the run-up to and during World War I. So they had some reservations about the all-big gun armament, because at the kind of battle ranges that they were expecting to fight at, their secondary battery of smaller guns could still penetrate the heavy armour that most dreadnoughts were being built with at the time, and obviously could fire quicker. So they were thinking in terms of, actually at the kind of ranges we think everyone's going to be fighting at, the Dantons might actually have an advantage. And, if everyone had chosen to fight at 6,000 to 8,000 yards, they wouldn't have been wrong, necessarily. But obviously that didn't actually really happen. The other factor was that to design a brand new ship takes a long time, especially if you're pre-World War I France. The design process of the Dantons was pretty much ongoing during construction as well. So they had just about arrived at a finalised design shortly after Dreadnought entered service for the Dantons, and they could either try and build them now and then work on a successor, or they could scrap the whole idea, start over again, at which point they probably wouldn't have had a design down to build or ready to build until probably 1908, late 1908, early 1909. And once they've gone through, got all the contracts made, as they would always do at that point, final revisions to the design, and then actually got to laying it down, you wouldn't really have saved all that much time or effort over the historic 1910 laydown time of the Corbeys, except you wouldn't have the Dantons. And as I say, they might be obsolete if they're going up into long-range gunnery duels with full-on dreadnoughts, but considering that France was mostly concerned about Italy and or Austria-Hungary, both of which had reasonable-sized fleets of pre-dreadnoughts, and France, for all its efforts, really was a little bit low on pre-dreadnought numbers, it made more sense to just build the things and use them to sort of prop up the numbers. And they weren't awful ships, to be perfectly honest. So, I mean, to be honest, the Dantons, as an example of a semi-dreadnought, are certainly much higher up the pecking order than the Corbeys are as an example of a first-gen dreadnought. Dave Collier asks, how much at fault was Admiral William Halsey for the damage and loss of life caused by Typhoon Cobra in 1944? What would have been the effect and risks of moving the fleet to seek shelter rather than remaining on station? He bears a fair bit of responsibility. He didn't make quite a number of wrong calls when it came to this. And the thing was, the fleet was on its way to refuel and resupply. It wasn't trying to head on station or stand in formation against kamikazes or anything like that. So there wasn't as much of a need for the fleet to stay in formation as it would have been a few days ago. Now, in his defence, Halsey was given somewhat incorrect information about where this Typhoon was going. It's not like he tried to steer them straight into the heart of the storm deliberately, even though that's what he actually ended up doing, albeit somewhat unintentionally. However, at the same time, he didn't release the ships to independent operations, i.e. effectively do the absolute best you can to stay afloat, rather than do the best you can to stay in formation and secondarily try and stay afloat anywhere near close enough in time. And he persistently underestimated just how bad this was going to get, even by the time the barometers really started to drop. And this is kind of those two combined with the orders that result from that, trying to get some of the low fuel destroyers to refuel instead of ballasting down by flooding their tanks with seawater, is pretty much responsible for the bulk of the loss of life, especially from the 3 destroyers that sank. Now, that much is his responsibility, and there's also the fact to consider that, to be perfectly honest, it may have also been something of his aggressive nature that contributed to the destroyers being in that state in the first place, because some of the destroyers were down to less than a day's worth of fuel, even at normal steaming speeds, let alone high speed. And some of his aggressive nature may have left the fleet in range of Japanese attacks and supporting the landings, maybe just a fraction longer than was necessarily advisable in terms of having a reserve for the refueling process. If he'd pulled back 12 or 24 hours ahead of time, then at that stage in the war, it's not going to make a fantastic amount of difference to the outcome, if at all. And the ships would have had more fuel aboard, which A, would have meant them more stable, and B, if they know they've got at least a day's worth of fuel, then no matter how bad the weather's going to get, they're not going to be sitting there going, oh, well, we need a bunch of fuel, so we're going to have to try and head for the oil tankers instead. They would be able to just go, oh yeah, okay, we're going to ballast down and ride it out. And this is the thing, there were destroyers almost exactly the same as the ones that went down, who had a bit more fuel in their tanks, or just went, stuff it, we're flooding our empty tanks with seawater, and they actually made it through with relatively little damage. It was the ones that either didn't or didn't do it in time that rolled over and sank. So yeah, there's that. So yeah, he's not 100% at fault. As I say, he didn't just look at a massive typhoon coming and go, oh yes, well, we're the US Navy, we'll be fine, charge. There were some mitigating factors, but, well, one, he was in charge, so ultimately the buck stops with him, and two, he did make a number of wrong calls, which did cost the fleet a number of ships and a lot of sailors their lives. Robert Henry Ilston asks, how did Germany get ships into the Mediterranean Sea when Great Britain controlled Gibraltar? The short answer is they didn't, not during wartime, at least as far as ships are concerned. They did get a number of U-boats into the Mediterranean in both wars, but that was done by, shockingly enough, sending the submarines under the water, where they were very much more difficult to detect, especially in World War One, and so they could just sail on through, usually at night. In terms of getting ships like, say, Goeben and Breslau into the Mediterranean, that was done before World War One broke out, and for pretty much the reason that the British controlled Gibraltar, that's why they were stuck there. They couldn't get back out again, and they ended up having to go to Turkey, or as it was called at the time, the Ottoman Empire. The other way the Germans managed it in World War One, when they were allied with Austria-Hungary, was to actually send prefabricated U-boats by land to Austro-Hungarian ports, where they would then be assembled and put back into the water. Texas and LaShock asks, what exactly was Operation Governor, and why did it fail? Operation Governor was an attempt to distract the Germans from the imminent Allied landings in Sicily, i.e. Operation Husky, and the conclusion as to how best to do this was to frighten, or try and frighten, the Germans into thinking that the Allies were about to invade Norway instead. Bearing in mind this being the middle of 1943, the Germans still had Tirpitz, Scharnhorst, and a couple of the Deutschland class available. So they had a substantial naval presence in the area, as well as obviously there being Hipper-class cruisers and various destroyers that were also floating around in both German and Norwegian ports. The idea, therefore, was to come up with two forms of bait. So first there was a simulated invasion convoy, which would sail towards southern Norway. And then there was what should look like the escort group for this invasion. And the idea was to generally divert German naval, air and army attention northwards, so they'd all be looking at that and hopefully not notice the massive Allied fleet that was heading towards Sicily. And in a lot of ways it kind of shows just how much of an advantage the Allies had at sea even by mid-1943, that they could have forces, obviously mostly American, fighting in the Pacific. They had a force capable of just sitting off of Sicily, offering shore bombardment and scaring the Italian fleet in the Mediterranean. They still had forces doing Arctic and Atlantic convoy escort duty, and they were able to put together a credible-looking invasion force and covering force for a feint at Norway. Now, the idea was that they would send a small, relatively speaking, covering force. So that was the battleship Anson, King George V class, along with USS Alabama, South Dakota class, accompanied by HMS Illustrious and a mixed force of American and British destroyers. That would supposed to be looking like the covering force. Now, two battleships versus two German battleships, albeit one of them the Scharnhorst, but with the British American force not having any cruisers present, might then look like a tempting target for the Germans, because if they don't want Norway to be invaded, they're going to have to kill an invasion convoy, but to do that, they're going to have to get through the defences. And if you're totting up the numbers, you might think, if you're a German admiral, that's actually, with Luftwaffe's support, we might actually win that one. Shall we give it a go? And that was the whole point, because the Allies had another even bigger force waiting just over the horizon, which was Duke of York, obviously King George V class, South Dakota, no class necessary there, another carrier, albeit it was Unicorn, so it was a smaller one, a light cruiser, and even more destroyers. And then they had a separate force with some heavy and light cruisers more closely associated with the fake invasion convoy, but they could have come north as well. So the Allies actually had overwhelming force. The whole idea was not only to distract the Germans, but ideally to get the Germans to commit their naval forces in Norway to try and deflect this supposed invasion, at which point this second force, and possibly even the third force, would show up over the horizon and go, oh yeah, the numbers, the fair fight thing you thought you were going to have, yeah, you're not having that. And no matter what else you might think, two King George V's and two South Dakotas versus Tirpitz and Scharnhorst is not a fair fight by any metric. So, that was the idea, but as obviously history tells us, the Germans did not sail out for glorious battle. The reason for that, which in some ways you could deem it as the failure, although the Allies deemed it a success for various reasons, but the reason you could see it as a failure is the Germans took one look at it and went, why would we sail out into battle against you? Because the Luftwaffe spotted the various formations of shipping, and so it was a combination of, one, if we sail out to fight, yeah, we might beat that first group, but we might also not, and to be perfectly honest, even if we did beat that first group, we probably wouldn't have enough strength left to tackle the close cover group on the convoy, which was the heavy cruisers and Belfast, along with some destroyers. But also, if you've spotted the second battleship force, yeah, at that point the Germans would be sitting there going, I don't like those odds. It's much better to stay in harbour, and then at some point those battleships are going to have to go away for fuel. And so if the invasion is actually real, then when the battleships go away, then we can sail out and attack the invasion convoy. But we're not dumb enough to take on 2-1 or 3-1 odds, just for the sake of it. And so Tirpitz, Scharnhorst, etc. stayed quite happily and firmly within Norwegian ports and refused to come out. So unfortunately the big battle didn't happen. Onboard G1 asks, what differentiates a ship from a boat, and when did this distinction come about? The short answer is that there isn't an answer, or at least no simple answer. Everyone has their own definitions, and those definitions change over time. So, for example, back in the Age of Sail, then a ship was a vessel that had 3 masts and was square rigged. Anything that had less than that was not a ship. Whether or not it was a boat was something of an argument, because you could end up with small frigates and such, and that were definitely, at least to the common sense point of view, not boats, but they definitely also weren't ships. And this is why you could have sort of things that were bark rigged, sloop rigged, or ship rigged, depending on the type of sails that they had. There's also the option that Onboard G1 himself mentions, which is a slightly more technical definition, that a boat heels into a turn, i.e. if you turn a boat hard left, the boat will lean left, whereas a ship heels out from the turn, which you will see with larger vessels. If you have a look at say one of the Nimitz class carriers doing a hard turn to port, you'll notice that the ship actually leans to starboard as it goes round. So there's those. There's the good gold definition of, if a vessel can carry another smaller vessel, then it is a ship, and the thing that it's carrying is a boat. Whereas if it can't, then it's not a ship, it is a boat, because it can be carried by something else, which it kind of works, because you've had, like here, you've got the cruise ship and multiple lifeboats that are all down the side of it. But then you can get into rather absurd situations where you can have say a small yacht that has a rigid inflatable tied to the back end, so it's technically carrying a smaller vessel, but does that make it a ship? Most people probably argue no, especially when you have things like tug boats, which would be substantially larger and probably are carrying their own somewhat more substantial lifeboats. Although the whole does it carry another vessel kind of works when it comes to submarines, which everyone loves to call boats, because obviously they don't carry other boats. Although I've yet to see another ship outside of a floating dry dock carrying a submarine, at least one that wasn't a midget sub. There's another one I rather quite like, which is a ship is a ship if its captain gets annoyed if you call it a boat, whereas a boat's captain won't care if you call his boat a boat or if you call it a ship. Yet another definition I've heard is that a boat carries out its primary functions on that deck. It probably only has one deck, but on the deck is where its primary function is carried out, whereas on a ship, most of its functions are carried out inside the ship. It's rather difficult to do anything inside a rigid inflatable. You have to be on the rigid inflatable, really. And that's before you get into the various legal definitions, because there are certain places where even things like displacement and length count in. So if your vessel displaces more than X hundred tons or is longer than Y meters or feet, then it's counted as a ship for legal purposes. And if it's a foot shorter and a ton less, it's a boat. Which seems somewhat arbitrary, but there you go. So yeah, lots of different definitions. Pick and choose the one you like the most, basically. And lastly for this week, Timo Fiebech asks, We know of ludicrous modern ship designs, HMS Incomparable, Tillmans, HMS Habakkuk, etc., but were there other earlier ship designs that were far too ambitious or ludicrous to actually ever be built? Well, as the old demotivational poster goes, never underestimate what you can accomplish when you have vision, will, and an endless supply of cheap and expendable labour. And ultimately, properly ancient ships of antiquity, not really my strong suit, but there were, in the Age of Sail, certainly a number of, shall we say, rather interesting plans for ships that probably would have been inadvisable to build. HMS Kent is a good example of that. Basically, you think Santissima Trinidad, only not quite as lumbering and also on steroids. The thing is, the further back you go, obviously formal designs tend to become less and less, and more ambitions, and maybe if you're lucky a sketch might be what you get, but with less overall formalized shipbuilding experience in some ways, but also an awful lot of practical building experience as well as sheer stubbornness in others. The ancient shipbuilders seem to have constructed quite a lot of ships that probably shouldn't have been built, and even by their own admission in some cases were just so hilariously impractical. They basically said, yes, I have built this thing, look at how great and powerful I am. Just kind of ignore how possibly unwise and expensive this all was, but never mind. But yeah, in terms of Incomparable, Tillman, Habakkuk style old school ships, I personally can't think of any offhand. If anyone wants to chime in and talk about some that they know of, then go ahead. There are quite a number that are described, which it has been then subsequently in more modern times challenged as to whether or not it's realistic that they were built. Things like the 40s. Basically, you got one bank, two banks of oars, it's a bireme, three banks of oars is a trireme, and then you've got a 40, which theoretically would be 40 banks of oars, but no one can quite figure out how that would work. So there's some argument as to, did they mean 40 banks of oars, or did they mean there were 40 oarsmen per segment, which would still be a lot of oars, but somewhat more practical. There were ideas for massive catamaran ships, ideas for a ship that had an absolutely socking great siege tower on top of it, and of course the Nemi ship, or ships of Roman Emperor Caligula, which have been gracing the screen at the moment, which effectively, I want my palace, but I want my palace in the middle of a lake, so we're going to build a massive, great, effectively barge, and then build the palace on the barge, and then we're going to sail that into the middle of the lake, because then I have a floating palace. And that appears to be the full extent of the reasoning behind them. There will be a special on those at some point in the next few months, actually. I've been greatly assisted by a viewer over in Italy who's been helping a lot with the research on that. So, with that said, I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you very much for listening, and that's all the questions. Just now time for a bit of channel admin. And hopefully you can all hear this channel admin section. So this channel admin section is to inform you that a number of things. So firstly, there's been a small but steady continuous trickle of orders for the Fleet Aeron posters. So anyone who's ordered those in the last week or so, those have all been posted now. Again, as I did say last week, but no one heard for some weird audio reason, if you ordered one and you got a dispatch notice and it hasn't arrived yet, then please do let me know, and I'll see what I can do about chasing them down. They were all dispatched quite a while ago, apart from the ones ordered in the last week, but obviously we'll see what we can do. Hopefully none of them have gone missing. That'd be quite nice for a change. On top of that, there is a couple of other things to talk about. You will have noticed in a community post, potentially, that due to my doing the Armchair Admirals series with wargaming, specifically World of Warships, and of course the mighty Jingles, former Royal Navy officer, gnome, and also Habakkuk now, they have, for my sins, made me part of their community contributor program. So what does that mean? Does it mean I'm selling out? Well, no, because I don't get paid for it. You can't sell out if you ain't being paid. No, but in all seriousness, for the channel, it's not going to affect the general video content. I'm still doing my 3 videos a week, the 5-minute guides, the Drydock, and the Wednesday specials. That's not going to change. The only thing that might be incorporated into that is that obviously now I can use all sorts of fancy graphics and drawings and artwork, etc. And so I might be incorporating some of those where applicable. It won't be too much, but where there are ships that need to be discussed that were never built and for which there aren't many photos of models, plans, etc., etc., there will probably be a fairly good case to go, look, if you want to see something, we're going to have to look at this. And to be fair, some of the models of the never built ships are actually relatively accurate. Obviously, a lot of them have been upgraded to match their tiers and such, but where those differences exist, I'll point them out. Kind of like, basically, imagine how I used the pictures of the Imperator Nikolai in the Imperator Nikolai video. So there's that, and occasionally I might I'll be putting in addition to all the existing content. Occasionally I'll put out, maybe on a Friday or something, some more historical based reviews of the various ships. Some that are upcoming, so that you can see what's coming there, and some that kind of mashing up a bunch of different ships so you can have a look over what things would have looked like, again, for visual reasons. So for those of you who watched the Belfast video, and I know I used this in the community post as well, for those of you who watched the Belfast video, I pointed out that Belfast looked very different in World War II to how it looks today, and it could have looked very more different still because of the original design with the quadruple 6-inch turrets. Now, the quadruple 6-inch turrets, because they were never quite finished, any remaining sketch designs are very much that sketch designs, but now you've got Belfast 1943 coming up, Belfast already in game, and Plymouth coming up in World of Warships. Those represent Belfast in 43, Belfast later on, and a revised town class with quadruple 6-inch guns. So I can use those models to illustrate the point a little bit better if I wanted to do a compare and contrast, that kind of thing. So hopefully no one's got a problem with that. As I say, your regular content will not be affected. You just get some more content potentially, and some interesting artwork, graphics, etc. And of course there's still the Armchair Admiral series as well, if you want to go and watch that every month. And of course, if you do happen to play World of Warships, it also means I can do giveaways of codes and ships and all that kind of lovely gubbins. And the final bit of channel admin, for this week at least, is that if perchance you happened to be a Scandinavian listener, or perhaps more specifically a listener in Sweden, I will be heading to Stockholm, which is not on the list of countries that you need to self-isolate from when you come back, at least at the moment, as far as the UK is concerned. I will be heading for Stockholm on the 16th of November, so mid-November. I will only be there for a couple of days, the 16th and 17th, and shockingly enough, I will be going to the Vasa Museum to go and have a look at the ship there, do a bunch of filming, talk to one of the main historians there, which should be very interesting, and then eventually compile that into a lovely video, which you will all see on the history of the history of the Vasa itself, why it was built, why it sank, how it was preserved, how it was recovered, and of course how it was then preserved in the museum where it resides at the moment. So that should hopefully be very interesting. So if you happen to be in or around the vicinity of Stockholm on the 16th-17th, drop me a line, probably by email or Discord DM, because I might miss it if you put it in the comments below. And then if you want to meet up, then I'm sure we can arrange something along those lines. So, with all that said and done, I think this is one of the longer channel admins I've done recently. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for listening, if you're listening instead of watching. And once again, feedback, comments, etc., all appreciated in the comment section below. And look forward to seeing you again in another video.